Well, I think growing up in Zanzibar, which is in a way a concentrated cosmopolitan society.
This series of presentation is part of the Awakening project.
And at that time, then I joined here. It was government Indian Junior.
Thank you very much, Nazmul, for the intro and showing the map which helps us to locate this talk. And thank you for inviting me to share my experiences and thoughts to this wonderful audience. I am also part of the audience and enjoyed all the wonderful and at times thought-provoking presentations, particularly presentations of Salim Bhai Sachedina, Shaukat Bhai Molu, and Shaukat Bhai and Razak Bhai presentation, which relates to my own. So I will try to make this presentation as enjoyable as I can, and hope that at the end of it, for those of us who are from East Africa, or their fathers or grandfathers who are from East Africa, will have a better understanding of some aspect of their past. So in the next 40 to 45 minutes, I want to share the story behind this book, which I have written, and relate some interesting outcomes from the research. I will cover as much as I can without boring you, and I want to keep this talk simple, although the book goes into a considerable details, which I cannot cover in the time allocated. But one thing good about Zoom is that if you get bored, then it allows you to do other things and still make Nazmul think that you are listening to the program. I want to begin by showing this slide. These are the photographs of our community members from East Africa. You may ask what is so special about them? Nothing special really, except that in these photographs, there is a time span of around 140 years of our history and identity. The interesting part is that these pictures show different dress sense of different cultures that we have accepted over years as we moved out of India to East Africa and beyond, and still maintained, on the whole, our identity as Khoja, Shia, Ithna-Asheries. So the question then is, why did we keep our identity? And how did we do it? This is the core subject matter of the book and my talk today. For the past 2 years, I have been writing a book titled Khoja, Shia, Ithna-Asheries of East Africa, their quest for new socio-religious identity from 1860 to 1960. The preparation for this book began some years ago, and once it is published, very soon I hope, you will read this book with some degree of sentimentality, particularly those who have come from East Africa. And those who are of a newer generation will find this book, I'm sure, interesting. There is a second book in the present preparation that deals with history from 1960 till 2020. The first thing I want to share is how I got motivated to write this book. I was born in Dar es Salaam. The picture you see in the slide is the mosque I had known, and many of you who are from Dar can also recall it. As I was growing up there, I remember that I had a wonderful family and friends, and I felt I was swimming in the life of our Khoja, Shia, Ithna-Asheries community in Dar es Salaam. After all, I was born into this community. It was my community. I had no idea why I had an identity Khoja, Shia, Ithna-Asheries. And actually, I did not find it necessary to go deeply into it, just like I suppose majority of you. I took it for granted that my community is there and will be there for me. The extent of my understanding of heritage did not go beyond my birthplace and my parents' birthplaces. This was my world as I left for UK in 1968. I was aged 16. UK was a different world altogether. There was no community like we had in East Africa. there was Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries Union in London. They arranged programs where all the East African Khoja Ithna-Asheries met, and we talked about home with some nostalgia. Then came the expulsion of Asians from Uganda in 1972. A good number of whom came to UK, and with this increase, Jamaats began to be formed the way we had in East Africa. I witnessed this transformation and to some extent also participated in the transformation. In 1996, I was appointed the Secretary General of the World Federation. Now, in this role, two things struck me. I would say that it struck me almost immediately. One was how small our worldwide community is, and secondly, how blessed our community with huge amount of wealth. Yet, in the midst of this wealth, I could observe the level of poverty that should really not exist in our community. I thought that as a small community, we are truly blessed with wealth, but to what end have we formed the community? For me, the search began, but the spark that led me to ask even more fundamental questions came in Skardu. Skardu is in Pakistan, situated in the foothills of Himalayas, where World Federation had supported educational projects. And I had accompanied Marhumullah Sahib in 1999 to assess the progress of these projects. It is extremely cold in the evenings. And so sitting around a burning stove, the subject for discussion one night happened to revolve around lack of interest in our common heritage within our community, its language and literature. And this discussion opened up more curiosity as to our origin within myself. The third issue that challenged me when I was Secretary General was the issue of membership in our Dubai Jamaat, which sadly opened up the question of the rights of the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries from India and Pakistan in the community. This also opened up the notion of our own identity and the complexities within it. So then I began to ask, what is the future of the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries community? Will it provide the same level of comfort to my grandchildren as it has done to me and my children? What is the guarantee then? And how did it all begin in any case? And thus began my journey to write this book. My first challenge was how to build a good narrative for this book. So I began to search the community archive for the first person from our community who came to East Africa. I thought if I find the record of this person, then I can weave the story of our quest for socio-religious identity around this person and make it interesting. According to our community archive, the earliest recorded history is that of Haji Sachupira. He arrived with his parents in Zanzibar in 1839 when he was 3 years old. After a short stay, they departed for Kilwa in a dhow which sank, and his parents were drowned. He was then looked after by his uncle in Zanzibar. What we know from the family history and the recorded history is that around 1850, he moved to Mjimwema, an area in the village of Zimzima, a commercial village which later on transformed into Dar es Salaam. This brief recorded biography gave me a timeline from which to ask relevant questions like, what was the Khoja community like in 1836? What made his parents leave Mandvi in India where they were living? Why did they come to Zanzibar? Why were they going to Kilwa from Zanzibar? What was so attractive about Zanzibar? What was the Khoja community in Zanzibar like? How did they separate from the main Khoja community and form their own Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries Jamaat and build their own mosque by 1880? So these were sort of questions in my mind and led me to a time frame from 1836 and a framework to construct a narrative for the book. So I began the search, and I also began the research. The first question I asked was why the parents of Haji Satchupira departed from Mandvi in 1839. And so I began to explore the collective past of our community. And here, I don't want, because of the allocated time, I can't go into details, but there are two things to take note when we look at our collective past. The first one is prior to arrival of Aga Khan #1 in 1840, Khojas conducted their affairs in an organized way. Now this is very interesting. They appointed their own Mukhi and Kamadia. Mukhi and Kamadia means a leader of a congregation, maybe, we can put it like that, and a Kamadia is his assistant in a simplified form. They held meetings to decide on disputes, collected contributions for various communal expenses. Their religious identity was a blend of Hindu, Muslim, Shia, Sunni customs and beliefs. And they participated in the traditional Shia practice of the commemoration of the martyrdom of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Second, when Aga Khan I came to India, his interference in the settled affairs of the Khoja community elicited a reaction against him, followed by two important court cases that Aga Khan won. Subsequently, we see a split first of a Sunni Khojas and then the Shia Ithna-Asheries Khojas. Now here, we can raise an obviously interesting question. If Aga Khan would not have come to India or not interfered in the settled affairs of the community, how would have Khoja community evolved? Now that's an exploration for the future, not for now, not for this book. The other thing I needed to do was to find out what made our great-grandparents leave Gujarat for Zanzibar and East Africa coast, and why there. This was a difficult task for me because there were no individual written records available that can explain it. So I began to look at the big events that were happening at the time around 1830s, which could have pushed our great-grandparents to migrate from Gujarat outside of Gujarat, not within Gujarat and India, but outside of Gujarat. One big event that pushed the migration was earthquakes followed by famines in Kutch around 1830s, which pushed families to live for better opportunities. Then there was the ending of slavery and formation of Indian indentured labor system instituted in 1834. With the end of slavery, what was happening was that the easy availability of human labor was not there. So the plantation owners with the British colonial government of India devised the Indian indentured labor system for workers to go out to South America, South Africa, Fiji Island, and West Indies. And under this system, when it ended in 1920, rather 1917, 1920, nearly 1 million Indians had left India to work overseas. And 32,000 of them came to East Africa to build railways. But from my research, Khojas were not wholly came on that basis. They came as entrepreneurial Gujarati Khoja explorer and for better opportunities. Then there was the pool of the Indian Ocean. For centuries, Indian Ocean facilitated trade between India and East African coast. Khojas took these trading opportunities and migrated to places like Zanzibar, Lamu, Mombasa, Bagamoyo, Tanga, Kilwa. Our great-grandparents boarded dhows and came mostly to Zanzibar, and it took from 3 months to 6 months to arrive at the East African coast. So why Zanzibar? Historically, Zanzibar was a well-known commercial hub, and our community archives reveal that majority of our community members began to arrive in Zanzibar from around 1885 onwards. Most of them arrived in Zanzibar with little or no money or skills except determination to succeed. Few of them were businessmen. Some were farmers, and some were as young as 12 to 15 years of age. They worked in the employ of mainly established Khojas. After a brief apprenticeship, they will start up their own small shops with goods advanced by other Khojas. Once they have made a small saving, they generally return home to marry and come back to East Africa. Now, this time to repeat at a larger scale the trade for which they now have both the skills and experience. Only this time, they have the support of a wife to rely upon to carry out their trading expansion. The role of early Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries women pioneers has not been fully explored, although I go in some details in the book, yet women of our community played a crucial role in bringing about social and economic transformation in our community. Some women became institutions by themselves, by the sheer force of their personalities, whilst others were involved in media and other aspects of community development. To some extent, as I said, I explore this in the book, but this area we need a solid research. The other interesting thing to emerge from the research is how adaptable our community was to the Swahili culture of Zanzibar. The Swahili culture has a plural ethos that resonated with Africans, Arabs, Khoja Indians, and also Europeans. We find that many Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries in Zanzibar at a very early stage adopted Swahili dress and Swahili language and created a moving Jangbari life for themselves. The Swahili culture was much evident when one visited Forodhani in the evening in late 19th century and up to mid 20th century. At its core, Forodhani was a place of relaxation, business discussion, and networking and partaking of food in the open air. An evening in Forodhani displayed Zanzibar at its best, and Swahili language was the glue that made it possible for different cultures to cohere as Jangbaris or Zanzibarians. And I want to make a point here that the setting up of a community based on belief and its nurturing largely took place in Zanzibar, and then it spread to other parts of East Africa. In fact, in the book, I relate briefly accounts of the first pioneers, such as Tharya Topan, Sewa Haji Paru, Ali Dina Basram, Murabbi Sharif Jiwa Surti, Virji Bhai Muraj Haji, father of Nasir Virji, Haji Devji Jamal, Natha Gangji, Dharamsi Khatau, Dharamsi Gangji. These are a few examples of Khoja Ismailis and Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries to show how Zanzibar was a starting place of their journey and then move on to search for better life in other places of East Africa. As Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries began to settle in Zanzibar, they came under varieties of positive and negative influences. Let me share a couple of them with you because that will give you some idea. Number one was the positive commercial influences in Zanzibar of Omani sultanates. Muscat and the west coast of India were trading for centuries. By early 19th century, there was a Khoja community already settled in Muscat. Omani Sultanate was familiar with Indian and Khoja commercial houses, and under Omani Sultanate, Khoja trading activities expanded, and enterprising Khojas took advantage of the economic opportunities such that by 1840s, Khojas were the dominant economic community in Zanzibar and along the East African coast. Number two was the influence of the British. After 1840s, the British began to control Zanzibar, and by 1890s, their control was complete. And they used their legislative power in commercial areas where Indians were prohibited to own specific type of land. So Khojas were confined to trading goods and finances, whilst the white British expatriates had freedom to own land and trade. This is one of the factors that led to the growth of the Indian and Khoja Dukawalas in East Africa. The British also used their powers, soft powers, very subtly. One use of this power that I discuss in the book was the issue of Nazi Moja burial ground case of Zanzibar, where the British supported Aga Khan III and Ismaili community over Sunni and Ithna-Asheries community. Why did the British took side without looking at the merits of the fact? I'm just looking at my notes here. Well, one explanation put forward was that for the British colonial authorities in Zanzibar, Aga Khan III was of high value because of his position as the spiritual head of the Shia Ismaili sect, and they could exert through Aga Khan III a strategic influence to pursue their imperial agendas. So these were the two sort of influences that I thought I would share with you. Now, beyond economic stability, Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries also wanted socio-religious stability. And this was one of the most important factors that shaped our identity as Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries and our legacy in East Africa. When our great-grandfather arrived in Zanzibar in 1830s and 1840s, they were most likely members of the Khoja community that met at the Jamaat Khana. The Jamaat Khana in Zanzibar was built in 1838. Up till 1870s, the cultural life of Khoja community revolved around the Jamaat Khana. At that time, there were no sectarian tendencies within the Khoja community to speak of. Most Khoja Muslims used to attend the Jamaat Khana. In the Jamaat Khana, there was a place of Qibla where Salat was recited. Those who wanted to pray Salat were able to perform it, and those who wanted to do Bandagi could also do it. Jamaat Khana was a community space in which the Khoja community gathered to network and come to know the latest information or news of their families and communities in India. Jamaat Khana transcended physical space, and the Khoja community felt connected. So what led to the formation of a separate Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries community in Zanzibar? One big factor that led to the separation was that in 1870, news reached Zanzibar that some Khoja members who had expressed belief in Shia Ithna-Asheries faith were ostracized. And this news opened up the division in the Khoja community. Some in Zanzibar, who were already professing Ithna-Asheries beliefs, met in the Old Faith school to discuss communal and religious issues. They were guided by Zanzibari Persian and Bahraini Shia Ithna-Asheries alims. The wider Khoja community saw the Faith group as a dissident movement, and the split became inevitable. And I don't want to go into details as I go into some detail in the book. By 1881, however, the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries of Zanzibar had their Quwwat Jamaat mosque with the Imam, Quwwat Jamaat, they had a Jamaat, a mosque, and an Imam Bada, and a community of 250 Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries. So Zanzibar community, Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries, created their Jamaat and built their mosque almost 10 years before Mumbai built theirs. The relationship between Jamaat Khan and Quwwatul Mosque remained cordial until the arrival of Aga Khan III in 1899 and then again in 1905. This settled environment of Shia Ithna-Asheries and Shia Ismailis should have pleased Aga Khan III. What we see instead, however, are the fiery directives which also predicted the demise of the Shia Ithna-Asheries faith worldwide within 100 years. And the directives also forbade marriages and social intercourses between members of the Ismaili and Ithna-Asheries groups. And this led to confusion and despair within families. Some remained Khoja Ismailis and others became Ithna-Asheries, and mingling between these two groups became difficult. And from this time, we observe the term Ismaili or Aga Khani and Shia Ithna-Ashery became more prevalent in every institution that each community built. So for example, when an Ithna-Ashery built an institution, then they will call it Shia Ithna-Ashery Jamaat or Shia Ithna-Ashery Mosque or Shia Ithna-Ashery. This is how, sorry, Khoja Shia Ithna-Ashery, Khoja Shia Ithna-Ashery. This is how they identified. And then so that they could identify as opposed to Khoja Ismailis. So this sort of became more prevalent in East Africa. We don't see the word Muslim. We see instead Khoja Shia Ithna-Ashery. By the second decade of 20th century, the split was complete, both theologically and socially. So it is interesting to note that less than 10 years of splitting from the main Khoja community, Khoja Shia Ithna-Ashery of Zanzibar were undergoing a further split within themselves. The reason for the split are not entirely clear. Did the split occur due to the differences of opinion on religious issues, or was it a caste culture related issue? It appears to me that all of these reasons together could have become the cause of the rifts within the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries that resulted in the formation of a Hujjatul Islam Jamaat with their own Imam Baraz and mosque. So the question that does arise and needs exploration is why this split of Zanzibari Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries at a time when the rest of the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries were facing challenges from within the larger Khoja community. One would expect that a comparatively small Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries of Zanzibar with new religious identity ought to have had strong bond of unity amongst them. But this is a question that needs further exploration. I don't go into in the book with greater detail because this needs some qualitative work. So in spite of the internal split within the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries in Zanzibar, both the communities began to establish itself socio-religiously. What we see is that the vital socio-religious activities were being established by then. We're talking about 1901 onwards. For example, we see emergence of local Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries reciting majalises in Gujarati or Kutchi. Many of our own ladies came forward to fulfill the religious and spiritual needs of the women of our community. And in time, well-known Quran reciters emerged from the community and appreciated by all communities in Zanzibar. In 1900, the community had its weekly Samachar, which was the first community-based paper in Zanzibar. It has a very, very interesting history. The first editor has a very interesting history. The personality has a very interesting history. I go in detail about this personality and the brothers and the wives in the book. But suffice it to say that the Khoja communities already by 1900 had a weekly paper. Muharram and Chalum night activities were unique and attracted many. The Zanzibar Julus assumed a pattern of its own, and this pattern was adopted by other Khoja Shia Ithna-Ashery communities in East Africa. Hussein Day, where dignitaries from other communities were invited to reflect and express on the sacrifices made by Imam Hussein, was seen in action. And Kushali Bankro, very unique sort of event, among many others, were established by Khoja Shia Ithna-Ashery community of Zanzibar. These activities were uniquely different, both in its content and symbols that it expressed, and provided an identity different from other Khoja community. For many Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries who came to East Africa, Zanzibar was not only the first port of call, but it was also the learning curve to imbibe new culture, language, and an identity. Most of them worked hard, some thrived economically, some prospered well, and some challenged their beliefs and changed them. Here we can conclude with brevity, I suppose, that the first seedling to establish a Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries community with a new identity emerges in Zanzibar. And the first generation Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries pioneers nurtured it. Having learned and experienced both the struggle and success of how to build their own community, these Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries soon put these experiences to effect as they traversed into the interior of East Africa, first the coast and to the interior of East Africa and other coastal towns for better opportunities. In the mid-19th century, there were three major trade routes linking Zanzibar, the East African coast, and the interior. The first route linked coastal towns of Bagamoyo and Dar es Salaam to the interior towns of Tabora and Ujiji and beyond. And wherever the towns came in that trade route, we see the Jamaats developing. And I go through all those towns, by the way, almost 50 of them. The second route connected Kilwa with Lake Malawi, passing through the town of Lindi. And beyond Lindi, Songea, Tunduru, and then towards Lake Malawi. The third route linked Mombasa with Lake Victoria and then into Uganda, Jinja, Bale, Kampala, Kabiramoto, if I'm correctly pronouncing it, and all the towns in Uganda which had Jamaats, and then beyond Tanga to Arusha and Moshi. So Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries used these trade routes to venture out beyond Zanzibar and the coast towns of East Africa and into the interiors to trade and settle. Now in the book, I cover practically all the towns where we had established our own Jamaats, both in the coastal towns like Dar es Salaam, Lamu, Mombasa, Tanga, Lindi, and all the interior towns of Tanganyika, similarly in Kenya, similarly in Uganda. And this forms also a major section of the book. And I also discuss some personalities which contributed to the development of those Jamaats. Because of time constraint, I will only give you some points of interest to note here. First, the underdeveloped interior of East Africa was totally foreign. Our great-grandparents did not know the local interior language and no previous cultural contact with local Africans. This called for an orientation and adaptation. Not only our grandparents managed to do this, but many of them set up shops in many places. This is the evidence of their intention to make East Africa their home. Second, there appears to be a set pattern. So when any enthusiastic Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries went to a new place, other newcomers followed, and we see a sense of comradeship, where well-established Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries then helped the inexperienced one. The third point to note is the pioneering Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries needed to create their own socio-religious structures, to strengthen the fragile community first, and also to preserve the faith. To do that, they developed a set pattern which then gets replicated throughout East Africa. So, where 2 or 3 Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries families come together in one village or town, they held religious functions in each other's houses. When more families join them, they decide to form their own Jamaat and build institutions around it to preserve their socio-religious identity. What emerges from the research is that the 2 strong core objectives for the community were economic self-sufficiency and faith preservation. In the research, I also found that a matter which provoked strong feelings among the Indians was education. What we observe is that the setting up of educational institutions and building of schools was left to the initiatives of the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries themselves or jointly with various Indian communities. Colonial authorities were not too much interested. These schools were mainly run on a self-help basis through the philanthropy. Here, we find that our own philanthropists responded generously. Their prime motivation was not only to perpetuate the faith, but they also understood the immense value of having socio-education and health facilities for the community. If I can put it like this, they were the visionaries of their time. Another interesting observation is that each Indian community maintained its separate identity. At times, the Indian communities came together when their interests converged. But most of the time, they existed alongside the other communities with a peaceful economic rivalry, but with a sense of being different from one another. And the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries, among other Hindu and Muslim communities, were by this account not alone in maintaining themselves as a separate community. By 1920s, many Jamaats had formed in East Africa, and from 1927, we see the next phase of our institutionalization, which is our community's preoccupation with organizing a central structure. The discussion on the needs for central body began in Mombasa, which did not get anywhere, but in 1934, the editor of Munadi, Abdul Hussain Sachedina, provided the intellectual basis for establishing a central organization. If I can put it, he was among the first profound thinkers in the community who developed a clear sense of direction for Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries communities under a central platform. And some years later, this idea was moved forward by the magazine Salsabil, and Dar es Salaam Jamaat leadership took up the responsibility of holding the first conference of Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries of East Africa on 10th November 1945. There are two interesting things to note that provide us with the context of the time that the community was passing through. First point to note is that when the chairman Abdul Hussain Nur Muhammad said in his address, to the best mind of the community who were assembled there in the first conference of 1945, Abdul Hussain Bhai lamented that our community in East Africa is moving chaotically. It needed a solid purpose and practical direction and the right mindset. If a rich person thinks that his rightful place in the community is to rule over the community while show despair at the poor, or the youth of the community look at the leadership with rebellious spirit, then such mindset will not benefit the community. Instead, it will take us into a blind hole. We are living in times tumultuous change. We are living in the times of tumultuous change, and we need unity at all levels of the community, compassion in our dealings with each other, and a rule that makes us and rules that makes us an organized community. This is the beginning of us becoming a rule-based community with a constitution. Interestingly, such lamentations are still heard today in the community. Second point to note is that following his address, the conference went on to pass 3 resolutions. They were impressive and measured. These were the first resolution passed by the communities of Africa together. The first resolution sent a message of peace and love to all Ithna-Asheries settled in East Africa, exhorting them to treat each other with respect. The second resolution paid special tribute to all who provided selfless services to the community and made its settlement strong in East Africa. And the third resolution stated that Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries community will work towards future progress of East Africa. In this spirit, the central body of East Africa was born in 1946, which then evolved into what we now know as Africa Federation. And by 1960, nearly 50 Jamaats in East Africa were unified under Africa Federation, which had a voice that spoke for the whole of the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries communities of Africa. One can see here the community of Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries showing confidence through its own institution, Africa Federation, to chart out their own destiny as a community. This confidence is symbolized in a flag adopted, which you can see on the left side. The green background represented Islam that gave them hope. Kaaba in the center of the flag represented belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hajar-e-Aswad represented the objective in life, which is to serve God. 12 stars surrounding the Kaaba represents the 12 holy personalities from the family of the Prophet. The crescent on the flagpole symbolized brotherhood, and this flag clearly indicates progressive elimination of Hindu Ismaili relics and setting up of objectives in the community according to the Shia Ithna-Asheries tenets. And by 1960, the community was economically also very powerful. You can see it in Kenya. We had 83 different businesses in 5 towns. In Tanganyika, 606 different businesses in 42 towns. In Zanzibar and Pemba, 166 different businesses. In Uganda, 147 different businesses, 13 towns. When in all of East Africa, we only had 7,050 individual heads. So we consisted of only 7,050 heads with all these businesses. So you can see how economically, relatively speaking, of course, powerful we did become. What began as an inspiring plea by Marhum Abdul Hussain Sachuddin Azad, Azad is his pen name, it became a reality in 1946 with setting up of a central organization, but that by 1960 brought about entrenchment of Shia Ithna-Asheries faith and unity of purpose and function within it. And our community was sufficiently confident by that time to take destiny in their own hand, to overcome the challenges of the time, including divisions and disagreements within the community. So by 1960, at the belief level, we find the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries evolved around Khoja Ithna-Asheries tenets, and the flag adopted by the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries by 1966 symbolizes it succinctly, that what our beliefs are. At a structural level, Jamaat became a powerful unit in East Africa that guarded its autonomous way of functioning. They ceded their autonomy to regional federation only when centralization functioning necessitated it. This was done in consultation with other Jamaats. But when it comes to identity level, let's look at it. When our great-grandfathers came from the Khoja culture in India, there was Islam, Hindu, which was syncretized culture within a Hindu matrix. When they came to Zanzibar in East Africa, there was a Swahili culture of Bantu, Arab, Persian syncretized within Islamic matrix, because Zanzibar had a lot of Islamic influences. The question, of course, I was posing was how did the Shia Ithna-Asheries of East Africa identity synthesize? So there was a lot of gaps, and I did the research. And then my research tells me that in Zanzibar, what happened was that a comfortable space for faith and interaction within the host Swahili community gave us a space for the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries to develop. And then, of course, there was also easy adaptation and diffusion. Easy adaptation and diffusion of cultural elements between the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries and largely Swahili ethos, which was present there. And that synthesized or gave us a synthesis, and we eventually evolved into a Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries identity. So at identity level, by 1960, the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries community of East Africa had their own unique social religious identity completely established. When we look at the identity construction of our community in East Africa, we really have to consider 3 things. First, our great-grandfathers' experience at the time. Secondly, their state of mind as they faced adversities during separation from the Khoja community. And third, a cohesive way they blended faith and culture to unite them. Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries' identity therefore has its own complexity that has to take the account of its Indian geographical and cultural roots, the religious change from Hinduism to Ismailism to Shia Ithna-Asheries, as well as migration change that brought with its influence of colonialism and nationalism in the new land. So in this respect, by 1960, we were no different from any other Indians who had migrated from India and settled in East Africa. But in our quest for new identity, we had some defining factors that allowed Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries to maintain its unity and emerge as a distinct community in East Africa. The earlier pioneers, that is our great-grandfathers and mothers, were in search for a deep-rooted spiritual and religious identity, that of love for the Prophet and his family. In fact, this was the main reason for the pioneers to part from the main Khoja community. Beyond this, the evolution as a distinct community was also in large part as a result of the Swahili culture, ethos, they encountered in Zanzibar and the East African coastal towns. These new landmarks allowed them to reconnect and redefine themselves in the light of new experience that they underwent. This evolved identity has passed on from earlier pioneers to now second, third, fourth, and fifth generations through the family units, which acted as a secure vehicle of transmission. By 1960, Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries had carved out their own identity from this consciousness. In short, they created a sense of belonging, a desire to feel wanted within a network of social relationship built around the newly found faith, and a unique transformational experience that they underwent in being a Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries. It has a communal history of exclusion from Khoja community, but at the same time, retaining the caste name Khoja. There is no official document that provides me with the rationale for why we retain this word, Khoja. One plausible explanation could be that the word Khoja reminds all of us of our struggle in search of new faith. And as we moved positively towards our faith, we added Shia Ithna-Asheries to our identity. So our identity is not just Khoja. Our real identity is Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries. This connectedness gave all of us a profound meaning, self-worth, and identity to our experience, or to our existence rather. And as we did so, we made sure to preserve our Ithna-Asheries faith identity on a deeper plane and still retain our Khoja identity in an observable structural plane. This has served us to sustain the harmony between both religious and cultural and social identity so far. Now in the 21st century, whether the Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries of East Africa and their offsprings who were born outside East Africa will retain the identity Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries, or will they go on to reconstruct or deconstruct in the light of changing political, social, and religious ethos and challenges that the 21st century brings to them as a global community? This discussion I'm exploring in my next book, which I am writing, titled Khoja Shia Ithna-Asheries, not of East Africa, from East Africa, Quest for New Socio-Religious Identity, 1960 to 2020. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi